This is the story of how a regular traffic stop exposed a woman who was living a secret life, building a massive drug empire while working a normal 9-to-5 job. On the surface, Danielle Stafford was the kind of person nobody would ever suspect. She wasn't on any police watch lists, she had no criminal history, not even a minor offense. She was a university graduate who had a good, steady job as an engineer for a company called the Swift Group. To everyone who knew her, and to the system itself, she was a success story. She was just a normal, hard-working professional. If you looked at her finances, at least the ones on paper, everything seemed perfectly normal too. Her paychecks went into her bank account, and that money just sat there. There were no big, suspicious withdrawals, no strange money transfers, nothing that would make a bank or the police raise an eyebrow. But if you looked a little closer at her life, things didn't quite add up. For someone with a regular engineer's salary, she had a lot of nice things. For starters, she owned 2 different properties. The second house, which she bought back in 2018, was especially interesting because she didn't get a mortgage for it. She paid her share, almost £65,000, in straight cash, just stacks of bills, with no bank transfer and no paper trail. And it wasn't just the house. She had a collection of 9 expensive high-end watches. She owned 3 Louis Vuitton handbags. She was also taking trips to other countries, but you couldn't find any proof of it in her bank records. There were no flight bookings, no hotel payments, no records of her exchanging money for foreign currency. It was like she was funding this entire lifestyle with money that didn't officially exist. For 3 years, Danielle lived like this. She was spending way more money than her day job could ever provide, yet she never reported any extra income. Her bank accounts didn't show where the money was coming from. From the outside, it just looked like she was doing really well for herself. But her success wasn't coming from a promotion or a bonus at work. It was being built on selling Class A drugs. She managed to keep it all a secret, perfectly hidden away, until one evening in May 2020, when a simple mistake on the road put everything at risk. It was May 12th, in the city of Hull. Danielle was in her silver Audi, driving way too fast through the streets, cutting corners and overtaking other cars recklessly. A police car saw her and started to follow. They watched as she turned onto a few different roads before finally pulling into a car park. At this point, the police weren't thinking about drugs. This was just a routine stop for a driving offense. It was supposed to be simple. But as soon as an officer walked up to Danielle's window, they smelled something faint, but very clear. It was cannabis. And that one smell changed the whole situation. Danielle herself seemed calm. She handed the officer a small silver wrap that had a couple of buds of cannabis inside. She told them it was just for her own personal use, and that was all she had. But the officers had a feeling there was more to the story. They decided to search the car. It didn't take them long to find more. They found several more bags of cannabis, including one big food bag that was stuffed behind a seat. They also found an empty plastic tub that had drug residue inside it. In total, the cannabis they found in her car was worth over 1,300 pounds. And then, another clue appeared. Her phone started going crazy. It just wouldn't stop ringing. In the short time it took to drive her to the police station, she got 30 phone calls and 20 text messages. People were clearly trying to get in touch with her, and it was urgent. As they pulled into the station, one of the officers noticed she was moving around strangely in her seat, like she was trying to adjust something in the waistband of her pants. The officer asked her if she was hiding anything else. At first, Danielle said no, but then she admitted there was something. She told them, "It's not mine. I don't know what it is. I shoved it down my joggers when you pulled me over."
From between her legs, she pulled out a bag. Inside it were 56 individual wraps of crack cocaine, worth around 2,800 pounds. That was the moment everything truly fell apart for her. This wasn't just a small amount for personal use anymore. This was dealing, plain and simple. She didn't have a weapon, she didn't have an accomplice with her, and she didn't have a good story. All it took was one bad turn and one speeding ticket to expose everything she had built. Within a few hours, the police were on their way to her house, and they were ready to break down the door. By the time they got to her home in a quiet village called Cottingham, the police already knew this was serious. The amount of drugs in the car, the constant phone calls, it all pointed to a much bigger operation. Her house looked completely normal from the outside, just like any other three-bedroom home on the street. But inside, it was a different story. The officers forced their way in. The first thing they found was right there in the open, on the living room table. It was a big banana box, and it was filled with cannabis worth about £2,500. She tried to claim it wasn't hers, but right next to the box were weighing scales and empty food bags, the kind used for dealing. There were also 2 glass jars with more cannabis inside, worth another £370. She admitted that smaller amount was hers. The police then moved into the bedroom. They started finding cash hidden all over the place. £430 in one bag, another £670 in another. They found more bundles of cash tucked away in different corners. Then they found a safe on the floor. When they opened it, they found £7,580 inside. Again, she said none of the money was hers. But the biggest discovery was waiting for them outside, in the back garden. There was an old coal bunker, partly hidden behind some other storage containers. An officer looked inside and found a bag of coal, but buried behind it was a large glass jar. It was packed with hundreds of sealed drug wraps. 270 of them were crack cocaine, worth £13,500. Another 205 wraps contained heroin, worth over £4,000. This wasn't just stashed away. It was carefully hidden, protected from the weather, placed there so no one would ever stumble upon it. The search still wasn't over. Back inside the house, officers went into a small box room, and they found even more cash. One bundle had over £9,000 in it. There were other, smaller amounts scattered around in envelopes, in drawers, and just folded up inside clothes. It was everywhere. The quiet engineer's home was really a storehouse for a major drug operation. When the police searched Danielle's house, it wasn't just what they found that was surprising. It was how they found it. Everything had its place. This wasn't the setup of some low-level, chaotic dealer. It was organized. The drugs were separated, the cash was bundled, and every hiding spot seemed to have been chosen for a reason. It showed a level of control and careful planning that told police they were dealing with someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The full picture of her operation started to come together as the police continued their search. The cash, for instance, just kept turning up. In that small box room upstairs, they found a bundle with over £9,000, then another pile with more than £1,600, and it didn't stop there. They found smaller amounts tucked away all over the place, £700 here, £550 there. Some of it was even found stuffed behind the television, folded and held together with rubber bands. It was as if every spare corner of the house was being used for storage. When the police counted it all up, they had found nearly £27,000 in cash hidden throughout her home. When they asked her about it, Danielle had a story ready. She claimed that only a small portion of it, about 2,350 pounds, was actually hers. The rest of it, she insisted, belonged to someone else. Her official bank accounts told an interesting story, too. The police investigators looked into her finances and noticed something odd. She had been on multiple holidays to other countries, living a life that looked pretty great on social media, but there was no evidence of her paying for any of it. Her bank statements showed she hadn't exchanged any money for foreign currency. She hadn't used her bank card to book flights or hotels. For all the trips she was taking, there was no financial trail leading back to her official income. So what about all those fancy things? The police asked her about the 9 expensive watches and the 3 Louis Vuitton handbags they'd found. Her explanation was simple. They were fakes. She said they were just cheap copies that her relatives had bought for her as gifts from places like Turkey and Spain. She tried to paint a picture of herself as someone who was careful with money, not someone who would spend thousands on luxury goods. From the moment she was arrested, this was Danielle's strategy: distance herself from everything. She knew she couldn't deny everything, so she admitted to the smaller crime. She told the police that yes, she sold cannabis and had been doing it on and off for a few years. But when they asked about the hard drugs, the heroin and the crack cocaine, her story changed completely. She was adamant that those weren't hers. She told the police that she wasn't a Class A drug supplier. Instead, she claimed that she was just storing the drugs and the cash for somebody else. According to her, the real person in charge was a man from Liverpool. She said she knew him socially and that he had stayed at her house a few times. Her story was that this man had called her and asked her to do him a favor and bring him a bag. She told the police that she didn't feel comfortable doing it, but she agreed anyway. She insisted she had no idea that the bag contained crack cocaine. As for the thousands of pounds in cash and the drugs hidden in her garden, she said they all belonged to him too. She was just a trusted friend holding on to it for him. It was all just a big favor. Danielle was trying to make herself look like a small part of a bigger machine, not the person running it. After all, she had a lot to lose. She was a university-educated engineer with a good career. But while she was telling her story, the prosecutors were quietly building their case against her. They weren't just going on what the police found in the house. They had phone records, financial documents, and all the evidence they needed to connect the dots. And when they finally presented it all in court, the story she had carefully built would start to crumble. Fast forward to April 2023. Danielle Stafford, now 31 years old, was standing in the dock at Hall Crown Court. Dressed smartly and looking calm, she didn't look like the head of a drug empire. But the charges against her were very serious. She was accused of being involved in the supply of heroin, crack cocaine, and cannabis for a period of almost 3 years, from late 2017 to her arrest in May 2020. She was also charged with possessing criminal property, that being the nearly 27,000 pounds in cash. To all of these charges, she pleaded not guilty. The trial began and the jury was sworn in. For the first time, the full case against Danielle was laid out for everyone to see. The prosecutor, a woman named Nardine Bashir, stood up and began to tell the story. But she wasn't going to rely on guesswork or theories. She planned to show the jury the hard evidence. They had pieced everything together: the years of her living a lifestyle she couldn't afford on her salary, the 2 properties, the complete lack of bank withdrawals to pay for it all, and the carefully separated and hidden stashes of drugs and money. The prosecution was ready to prove that Danielle Stafford wasn't just looking after things for a friend. They were there to prove she was the one in charge. So back in the courtroom, the prosecution started laying out its case, and they focused on the one thing Danielle couldn't explain away: the money. They put it to the jury in a really simple way. Here was a woman with a good, steady salary as an engineer. Her paychecks were deposited into her bank account every single month, like clockwork. But the strange thing was that money never seemed to be used. There were no big withdrawals for a mortgage payment, no large transfers to pay for a car, no records of repaying for bills, shopping, or those expensive holidays. Her wages just sat in her account, completely untouched. Yet, somehow, she was living a life that someone earning 3 times her salary would struggle to afford. She had that second house, which she'd paid for with a huge chunk of cash. She had the designer handbags and a collection of high-end watches. She was taking trips overseas. But when the investigators checked her bank records, there was absolutely no trace of how she paid for any of it. She hadn't exchanged pounds for foreign currency. She hadn't used her card to book a flight or a hotel. It was all being funded by cash that seemed to appear out of thin air. When she was asked about this, Danielle had an answer. She said she'd cashed in some savings bonds to help buy the house and that she was just very good at managing her money. But the prosecution showed the jury that this simply wasn't possible. There was no legal, official source of income that could explain the lifestyle she was living. Her engineering job couldn't cover it, and her bank account proved it. The only thing that made sense was the drug money. This wasn't just a side hustle. It was a full-blown business.
Danielle's defense team, led by her lawyer Selma Mahmoud, tried to fight back. They didn't deny everything. They stood up and admitted that Danielle had been involved in supplying cannabis. That part was true. But they argued that her role in the more serious Class A drugs was very small. They tried to paint a picture of a woman who had been taken advantage of by that man she mentioned from Liverpool. They reminded the court that Danielle was an educated woman with a career. She had no previous criminal record. She had even been a volunteer in her community. They read character references from her old employers, who all said she was a good worker. Their argument was that she wasn't some hardened criminal mastermind. She was just a normal person who got herself into a situation that was way over her head, and she had shown she was sorry for it. But the prosecution kept coming back with the hard facts. They reminded the jury about the phone that rang non-stop the night of her arrest. They talked about how the drugs weren't just found in one messy pile. They were carefully packaged and hidden in multiple strategic locations, from the bedroom safe to the coal bunker in the garden. This was organized, and it was on a large scale. Then, right in the middle of the trial, something unexpected happened. As the evidence against her continued to pile up, Danielle and her legal team seemed to realize they were losing. They withdrew their earlier position. She decided to change her plea. In front of the judge and the jury, she pleaded guilty to all 4 charges. Just like that, the trial was over. It was no longer a question of if she did it. Now the only question left was how long she would spend in prison. When it came time for sentencing, the judge, a man named Mark Bry, made it clear that he wasn't buying the story she had tried to tell. He didn't believe for a second that she was just holding the drugs for someone else. He didn't believe that designer watches and handbags were fakes. And he certainly didn't believe that the tens of thousands of pounds in cash hidden in her house had nothing to do with her. He looked at her and said, "You were a street dealer in cocaine." He also pointed out that she had waited until the evidence against her was overwhelming before she finally admitted she was guilty. The sentence was handed down. For her role in supplying heroin, crack cocaine, and cannabis, and for possessing the criminal cash, Danielle Stafford was sentenced to 7 years and 6 months in prison. But that still wasn't the end of it. Months later, the court met again to figure out exactly how much money she had made from her drug empire. After looking at the value of the drugs, the cash, and her assets, they ordered her to pay back £96,263. This is part of something called the Proceeds of Crime Act, which is designed to make sure that criminals don't get to keep the profits from their illegal activities. She was given 3 months to pay the full amount. If she fails to pay it back in time, she will have to serve another full year in prison on top of her original sentence. Her deadline to pay is in early 2025, but right now it's unclear if she has paid the money back. So a successful engineer who built a secret drug empire from her quiet suburban home is now serving a long prison sentence, all because she was caught speeding. It just goes to show how quickly a secret life can unravel from one small mistake.
If you enjoy this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel for more interesting true crime stories like this.